The group of friends, Clara, Daniel, Julia, and Pedro, were tired of the city routine. After weeks of stressful work, Clara suggested a trip to a secluded place where they could relax without the interference of technology. After hours of searching on the internet, Daniel found the perfect place, an old cabin in the middle of a dense forest, away from everything and everyone. What could be more relaxing, they thought. The cabin was a 2-story wooden house with large windows and a rustic look that seemed to come out of a horror movie. The reviews about the place were few, but praised. Isolated and peaceful, a refuge from civilization. No one mentioned the place's dark past. Clara hesitated for a moment when she saw the extremely low price, but the others were so excited that their doubts soon disappeared. And so, with the car loaded with supplies and expectations, the group set off towards the unknown. During the trip, the mood was light, with jokes and music playing on the radio. However, as they approached the forest, the sky became cloudy, and a feeling of unease began to set in. Tall, dark trees lined the narrow road, and the cell phone signal was distant. When they finally reached the cottage, it was already dark. Julia, who had always been the most sensitive, felt a shiver as she looked at the house. "I think we should go back," she said, half jokingly but with a hint of sincerity. Pedro, the most skeptical, laughed and reassured her. "It's just your imagination." Little did they know that when they walked through the door, they had sealed their fates. The interior of the cottage was as rustic as the exterior. Antique furniture, a smell of aged wood, and the deep silence of the surrounding forest created a peculiar atmosphere. Daniel lit the fireplace, and soon everyone was sitting on the couch, relaxing. However, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows cast by the fire simply moved strangely, as if there was something on the walls. While the friends explored the rooms upstairs, Julia found an old wooden box under one of the beds. Inside was a collection of old photographs of families who had apparently spent their holidays at the cottage decades ago. But one photo in particular caught her eye. It showed a family standing in front of the cottage, all smiling except for the youngest daughter. Her eyes stared into space. Julia, who had always been a fan of horror stories, decided to show the others a photo of herself. They laughed at the coincidence, but the mood had changed. Clara couldn't help but feel a strange connection to the girl in the photo. She felt as if she was trying to warn her about something. That night, while everyone was asleep, Clara heard the sound of footsteps coming from downstairs. Thinking it was one of her friends, she went downstairs to check. When she got to the living room, no one was there. The fireplace, which had been extinguished before they went to sleep, was still lit, and the flames were glowing brightly. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind blew through the closed windows, extinguishing the flame and leaving Clara in total darkness. The next morning, Clara told her friends about what had happened during the night, but no one took her seriously. Pedro, always rational, said that the wind had probably come in through a crack. Trying to shake off their discomfort, they all decided to explore the area around the cottage. The forest was dense and mysterious, with trails disappearing between the trees. As they walked, Julia suddenly stopped, her eyes fixed on something between the trees. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. No one had seen anything, but Julia swore she saw a shadowy figure watching her. The group decided to return to the cottage, but the light mood from before had disappeared. Fear began to take over. When they returned, the front door was open, even though Clara was sure she had locked it before leaving. Something had changed. The furniture was out of place, as if someone or something had been moving around the house while they were away. A strong, musty smell filled the room, and Clara felt a cold presence beside her. During the night, Clara was awakened by a shadow standing in the doorway of her room. The figure was tall and indistinct, but its eyes glowed with a dull light. When she tried to scream, the figure disappeared. Trembling with fear, Clara ran to wake the others, but when she returned, Peter, Julia, and Daniel were fast asleep, as if nothing could wake them. The curse of the cabin was only just beginning to reveal itself. Clara could no longer sleep, tormented by the shadows and whispers that seemed to follow her every step. Julia, increasingly suspicious, began to search for answers. While the others tried to keep the mood light, she searched every corner of the cabin for clues as to what was really going on. It was then that Julia found an old diary hidden in a loose wall, just below the stairs. The yellowed, worn pages told the story of a family who had lived there decades ago. As she read aloud, her friends' faces grew serious. The diary belonged to the mother of the little girl in the photo, the same one Julia had found in the box the day before. The woman described how the family had bought the cottage to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, but they soon began to notice strange things. Sounds of children giggling at night, doors opening by themselves, and most disturbingly, a change in her youngest daughter's behavior, who began talking to unseen friends and complaining that they didn't want the family to leave. The parents tried to ignore it until the little girl mysteriously disappeared overnight. Leaving no trace, Clara was paralyzed when she heard about the child's disappearance. Pedro, still trying to remain calm, suggested that it was just a coincidence, but Julia knew otherwise. They were involved in something much bigger and more dangerous than they could have imagined. That night, the whispers returned, but this time not just for Clara. Everyone woke up to the sound of children's laughter echoing through the house. Clara ran to Daniel's room, but he was motionless, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He began to mumble nonsense, as if he were possessed by an invisible force. When he finally came to, Daniel couldn't remember anything. Desperate, they decided that they had to leave the cabin at dawn. But a dense and frightening fog enveloped the entire area, making any attempt to escape impossible. They were trapped, and the cabin's curse seemed to have fully awakened. With the exit blocked by the sinister fog, the group realized that their only option was to try to unravel the cabin's secrets. Clara insisted that there was a connection between the diary, the little girl in the photo, and what was happening to them. Pedro, although still reluctant to believe in anything supernatural, had no choice but to follow the group in search of answers. They returned to the diary. There was a final passage that Julia had not read before, written in a hurry and scribbled, almost illegible: "The sacrifice. They want the sacrifice. Only then will we be free." The word sacrifice left everyone cold. What did it mean? They began to realize that they were being led to the same tragic fate as the previous family. Daniel, increasingly affected by the paranormal events, began to have visions. He saw the little girl in the photo running through the hallways of the cabin, but whenever he tried to follow her, she disappeared in a cold mist. One night, he followed her to the basement, which until then, no one had explored. When they went down to the basement, the group discovered a claustrophobic space, covered in roots and humidity. On the floor, there were candle marks and symbols drawn in the earth, as if a ritual had been performed there. In the center of the basement, a small wooden box caught their attention. With trepidation, Clara opened the box and found an ancient medallion covered in dried blood. Suddenly, a wave of intense cold swept through the basement, and Clara fainted, as if something had taken hold of her. When she woke up, Clara seemed different. She looked at her friends with a blank stare and began to mutter about them and the sacrifice. It was now clear that the curse had taken control of her. Peter and Julia tried desperately to figure out how to free her, but Daniel, increasingly convinced that there was no way out, began to succumb to despair. The voices, shadows, and children's laughter grew louder, and the cottage seemed to take on a life of its own. Doors slammed, windows cracked, and the flames in the fireplace lit themselves. Everything indicated that the final sacrifice was about to be exacted. In the growing chaos, Clara began to act erratically, saying things that seemed to come from someone else. The figure of the little girl from the past now appeared in every corner of the cabin, looking at them with empty eyes, as if guiding them towards something inevitable. Julia, in a desperate attempt to save Clara, began to study the symbols in the basement, trying to figure out how to break the curse. It was then that they found a torn piece of the diary, hidden behind a bookshelf. The last entry revealed a sinister detail. The child was not the victim, but the vehicle. The curse consumes the purest soul, leaving only darkness. The sacrifice that the curse demanded was not from the adults, but from someone innocent. The curse wanted Clara, the most sensitive of the group. While they tried to stop the curse from taking Clara for good, Daniel was drawn back to the basement. There, he saw the little girl, who was now crying. "She took me, and now she will take you too," the girl whispered before disappearing. Suddenly, Clara fell to the floor, screaming, as the shadows of the cottage moved like snakes toward her. Peter and Julia tried to hold her, but an invisible force threw them away. The cottage vibrated as if it were alive, and a thick fog filled the room, making it impossible to see anything. When the fog finally dissipated, Clara was standing with empty eyes and an expression of complete absence. The curse had been awakened. Peter and Julia watched in horror as Clara walked toward the cottage door, as if guided by an invisible force. The entire house seemed to pulse with evil energy. Daniel, still in the basement, heard the whispers grow louder, now recognizing the voices of the souls trapped there. Peter tried to stop Clara from leaving, but was thrown violently against the wall, leaving him unconscious. Julia, terrified, remembered the words in the diary: "The sacrifice, the purest soul." The only way to break the curse would be to offer something in return. Julia knew what had to be done. With tears in her eyes, she ran to the basement, where she found Daniel surrounded by shadows. He was in a trance, mumbling words that made no sense. She knelt beside him, and in a last act of desperation, offered up her own soul, hoping that would be enough to free her friends. The house shook, the shadows retreated, and for a moment the cottage was silent. Clara fell to the floor, breathing heavily, but finally freed from the curse. Julia, however, disappeared, leaving only an echo of her voice in the empty hallways. The curse had been broken, but at a terrible cost. The cottage, now seemingly harmless, still stands, awaiting new victims.